The Bible tells us that we're made in God's image, after his likeness. We can't see God, so what does it mean to be made in his likeness? In this study series, Masters or Slaves, AI and the Future of Humanity, we're exploring how AI is impacting what it means to be a human being made in God's likeness, and what we need to do to protect our ability to be faithful image bearers so that we can be masters rather than slaves of AI. In this unit, we'll discover the ways in which we are totally amazing. Humanity is special because we are made in the image of an amazing God. That means that human beings are different from everything else that God has made. We're special. Developing an understanding of what it means to be made in God's image is often referred to as the doctrine of Imago Dei, which is simply Latin for the image of God. Let's begin in Genesis, the first book of the Bible, where we read that what God actually said was, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." Now that's significant because it introduces us to the concept of God being in relationship with others, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in relationship, or what we refer to as the Trinity. It's also significant because we reflect in some way the image of the whole Godhead, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. In the original Hebrew, image and likeness are really synonymous terms. They're not referring to some different aspect of the Godhead. Now, it's clear that we can't be made in the physical likeness of the image of God because God doesn't manifest himself in a physical form. He's what we call metaphysical. When God came down to earth in the person of Christ, he took on human form, so physically he looked like us. So if we're not like God in a physical sense, then God must be referring to his character, his nature, in a human sense, what we might call our inner being or our soul. Now, the Bible, God's self-disclosure to us, tells us a great deal about what he is like, his nature and his character. We know that he is loving, merciful, and kind. He's also righteous and just, something that his chosen people in the Old Testament were often criticized for not being. So what aspects of his nature do we share? That's been a question that has occupied theologians for centuries. The early church fathers like Tertullian thought that our free will was the essential stamp of God's image in us. Augustine, on the other hand, thought that we shared God's memory, his intelligence, and his will. Fast forward to the Reformation in the 16th century, and theologians developed a narrow and a broad definition of what being made in the image of God meant. Their thinking was that virtues like knowledge of truth and holiness were lost as a result of the fall. That's the narrow view. But they acknowledged there were aspects of the nature of God that all humans still possessed, even after the fall. Attributes such as intelligence, reason, natural affections, and freedom to choose. This was their broad definition for us being made in God's image. This view of what it means to be made in the image of God is referred to as the ontological view. That is, what is the nature or essence of our being? Or to put it simply, what are we made like? These attributes of our nature are key to our understanding of how AI might be impacting our ability to faithfully mirror God's image or God's nature. These attributes are, of course, all impacted by the fall and our own sinfulness, so that we don't love perfectly, even those closest to us. We don't have perfect reasoning powers or perfect intelligence. The Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Roman Christians, tells them that because people did not honor God, they became futile in their thinking, and he gave them up to a debased mind. As Christians, we need to remember that we are called to become more like Christ, to put off the old man, our sinful nature, and to put on Christ. That means that we are to be careful to reflect more and more of God's image in us. Indeed, Peter, in his letter, tells us that through Christ's promises, we become partakers of the divine nature, having escaped from the corruption that is in the world because of sin. There's another way in which we can understand what is meant by being made in God's image or after his likeness. And that's sometimes referred to as the functional view, or what God has made us for. Right after God saying, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness," he goes on to say, "And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over all the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." Some have argued that to be made in God's image means to oversee creation as God's vicegerents, his deputies, if you like. This view has gained currency over recent years as Christians have become more concerned about the environment and our responsibility to be good stewards of Earth's resources. Now, this view doesn't replace what we are made like. It complements it. And indeed, as we shall see later in the series, this stewarding role is an important factor in our thinking about how we should use artificial intelligence. A third view of what being made in God's image means centers around the idea that God created us for relationship. Just as the Trinity is in relationship, so humans are created to be in relationship with the Trinity, but also with other human beings, seen especially in the companion created to be Adam's wife. In this relationship, we see an intimacy expressed through their becoming one flesh. The relational purpose of God's creating humankind is borne out in Jesus' answer to the scribe's question to him as to what the most important commands are, recorded for us in the Gospels. Jesus, replying to the scribe, said, "The most important is, 'Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all of your strength.' The second is this, 'You shall love your neighbor as yourselves.' There is no other commandment greater than these." So there's no argument that humans were created for relationship, to love and obey God. And of course, if we're a Christian, this becomes the main goal in our lives, along with loving our neighbor as ourselves. Once again, this relationship view of Imago Dei is not at odds with the other views that we have considered. On the contrary, it complements them and enriches our understanding of what it means to be made in God's image. As we shall see later in the series, this view, the relationship view, has some important implications for our engagement with AI applications, like digital assistants, digital humans, human-like robots, and social media. In this fast-moving digital world, if we are to be faithful image bearers in our homes, our workplace, and our social gatherings, we need to understand what the image is that we are supposed to be reflecting to the world. We also need to understand how our engagement with AI might in some way diminish that image bearing or tarnish God's image in us. In the next session, we'll begin our journey exploring 6 key ways in which AI today poses a challenge to our being the human beings God made us to be, and what we can do to protect God's image in us, to protect our ability to reflect that image to our families, our children, our friends, and our work colleagues.